Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof, for the 14th of September 2023. And there is an awful lot of content to get through. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about the losses for the Russian Navy. As Darth Putin says here, I've lost more ships to a country with without a navy in a land war. I remain a master strategist. Okay, let's go on and go first to the Ukrainian General Staff losses for the Russian forces for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. Now, over 600 personnel lost yesterday. That's slightly higher than we have seen, nudging, up into the 600 to 700 mark. That's maybe significant. 15 tanks and 18 armored personnel vehicles is a massive loss in both of those categories for the Russians, and then 42 artillery systems. I mean, part of me thinks these numbers are just ridiculously high. Surely you can't just consistently be losing this amount of tech each day. But then, the evidence appears to point in the direction that they are suffering this kind of attrition. I talk about it every day. These are plausible numbers. 42 artillery systems is, though, phenomenal. 3 multiple launch rocket systems. That is, again, a significant loss. Anti-aircraft warfare systems. Well, actually, since this sheet was compiled, we'll talk about this. The Russians have lost possibly an entire S-400 battery in Crimea, another one worth over $1 billion. So, bad day at the office for the Russians again. 47 drones lost. That may be a combination of 2 nights of drone activity. And then the classic, they've added a new category, 1 submarine and 1 warship as well. And we'll talk about that a little later. 14 vehicles and fuel tanks. That's actually a low number for what we have seen. And 5 pieces of special equipment, electronic warfare, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, that kind of stuff. So I think, another really challenging day for the Russian forces. And we're still in this phase of really considerable attrition of the Russian forces. I don't think we're seeing these huge attacks along the front line because this is still a massively effective tactic for the Russians, or for the Ukrainians, a strategy even. Okay. So here we have the moment, a storm shadow.
Хорош. Пошли, вон, видишь? Нихуя себе.
So you can hear that cruise missile, fly through the sky. But interesting that the guy who's filming this in Sevastopol is delighted with the strikes. Good, let's go. So yeah, that's something. But that was the strikes on the dry dock and those ships in Sevastopol yesterday. Shoigu said that Ukraine used HIMARS and Storm Shadows to lay waste to their ships of the Black Sea Fleet this morning, which is ridiculous. So yeah, that's obviously nonsense that HIMARS can't reach that far, so he just doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. I mean, is that a purposeful mistake? If it is, it just makes him look like a fool, and if it is a mistake, then he's a fool. He's not knowledgeable enough. Goodness. Anyway, why is Ukraine focused on striking Russian landing ships? So this is one of the ships that was taken out in the dry docks. Now, it could be that they just took out, there was a ship in the dry docks, let's hit it. Or it could be that they are going for landing ships as well, because it's not the first one that they have targeted. The ships are designed to save Russian logistics at the moment when the Russian defense forces cut the railway line the Ukrainian defense forces cut the railway line running through Tokmak. After that, the Russians plan to supply fuel to their army group in the occupied areas of Zaporizhia region and in the southern part of Donetsk via occupied Mariupol, transferring fuel and heavy cargoes with the help of sea craft. And this is what I was talking about yesterday. And then they've delivered some trains, some diesel electric trains, to help get the train line back up from Mariupol. By the way, that's why the Russians are now working on restoring the railroad branch at the Mariupol port. If Ukraine is able to cut the artery running through Tokmak, it is already used very little due to the approaching front line, and deprive the Russian Black Sea Fleet of transportation opportunities. This, in fact, creates a kind of A2AD zone, anti-access and area denial zone for Russian logistics. And without fuel and regular supply of ammunition, medical supplies, equipment, it is quite difficult to fight, mildly speaking. So this could be hitting these kind of ships that can help to deliver supplies to coastlines. It could be part of a larger strategy, right? So there's solid evidence that both the Minsk and the Rostov-on-Don, so that landing craft and that submarine, have been destroyed in the dry dock. Round about 4,600 BRT sunk or destroyed. I'm not quite sure. I'm not knowledgeable of that acronym. Excellent operation by Ukrainian forces. So there's footage now coming out to suggest that particularly the landing craft is just done for. Here we have some satellite imagery showing you before and after, before, after, before, after. Some are saying it's not wholly clear that the submarine is definitely done for. It's difficult to tell because it's a darker, coloured vessel, so it doesn't show up the damage as much. But nonetheless, I think it is probably in a bit of trouble. The count up was 3 dead, 31 wounded, and 20 missing. And now the claims were from the Russians that these were workers. There are other Ukrainian sources claiming that actually you wouldn't have workers working on that in the middle of the night, and that it was almost certainly the Marines that were guarding or based near to these vessels. So the Ukrainians are claiming that Marines have taken out, Russians are claiming they're people working on the ships, on the vessels. So the Minsk, which is the landing vessel, landing ship, machine room was struck beyond repair. It's a claim there. So that's a really significant addition to those numbers. Right. Oryx here saying Russian equipment lost 6 pieces, Ukrainian equipment lost 5 pieces. So A, not a lot, B, fairly equal. So the Oryx have included a landing ship and a submarine on their numbers, and you almost might. There's part of you that thinks no, that you don't include that equipment. That's not, we just want tanks and all this kind of stuff. It's not like for like or whatever. No, like these are military pieces of equipment. They should be added to this list. So when you think, well, if you take that out, then there's only 4. Well, actually, no. Not only should these definitely be added, of course, they're military pieces of equipment, but these are substantial. These are worth, like, compared to a tank. I mean, there's like 100 tanks plus or whatever. This is a massive, massive loss for the Russians. Really, really huge. Then S-24M. I don't know if that's the one. Was that the training one lost in Russia in Volgograd, or was that a further one? T-90M, so it's another T-90 lost. There's some footage of one being taken out by a first-person view drone. Now, they've lost, I think, around 40 now. I think that's the 40th they've lost, visually confirmed. I might need to go and check that. Someone was saying 40. They only have 100 T-90s. That's like 40% of their best tanks lost. Wow. Ukrainians, radar is going to be their highest value thing there taken out. So that will be a bit of a sad loss for them. So yeah, first person view drone of a T-90 first person view drone footage of a T-90 being taken out there. So that is another T-90 lost, and as I say, possibly the 40th there. Now, talking about losses, here we have some more complaints from Russian units on the front line. This is from Klishchivka, and this is quite an important claim that they make. Interesting claim again, that there's only 25 to 30% of their unit remaining, that they haven't been paid, that they don't have counter battery fire, the comms are electronically jammed often, and so on and so forth. All the usual complaints, but it's just another piece of the jigsaw. And they're quite a long list of complaints that they go through there. 3.5 minutes worth of complaining. But yeah, that also shows that there are some huge losses in the Klishchiivka area south of Bakhmut. Now, we had heard previously that actually the Russians are losing a lot there. Andrew Perpetua is talking about how he can't understand why the Russians are still trying to defend that area given the losses that they have taken and the limited value of remaining in Klishchiivka. Interesting claim from Major General Christian Freuding from the German army here, MOD, saying that Russians have not managed to destroy a single Panzer Howitzer 2000 in Ukraine. So that's a self-propelled howitzer that the Germans have provided, one of the best in the world, a tracked self-propelled gun that has a pretty good range. There were some complaints, there were some issues, is the right word, with these some time ago with regard to them being fired so much that they weren't really designed to be fired so consistently and so much that they were having to get their barrels replaced and go back to Germany. That's probably still happening. I mean, I assume they're just getting absolutely hammered in terms of being overused, if you like. Okay, so normal claims of Russians striking civilian targets here. 6-year-old boys being killed in shelling in Kherson. 4 other people were injured in the attack by Russia on the Belozerka community, including the dead boy's 13-year-old brother. 3 other victims were neighbors who tried to help. So Kherson, although I've claimed that actually there's less of this going on, it appears, it could just be that it's so normalized that it's not reported as much. But I wonder whether the Russian artillery capability in the Dnipro River area has been degraded to the point that they aren't doing this as much, but it still is happening. And they still seem to be just, I don't know whether they're just not accurate. They've got worn barrels, or whether they just don't care, or whether they are, positively targeting civilian infrastructure. But yeah, I just don't understand it. Okay, strong fire in Luhansk. So this is Russia on fire, but occupied regions. It seems like a school in Sokoldilsk is ablaze, 6 to 7 kilometers from the border. I don't know whether there was an attack or if someone was smoking, but yeah, another fairly significant blaze going on there. It could be used as a barracks, or could just be that, I don't know, many options there. But this is a significant fire in Russia. There's a big blaze covering a couple of hectares. Russia says it happened due to depressurization in the Pishchany Umet to Storovzhivka gas pipeline. There's quite a bit of footage about this coming out now. Russian media report the gas pipeline is on fire near Saratov in Russia. That's a big old fire, I don't know what will happen about that, but yeah, as I say, lots of imagery coming out. According to eyewitnesses, an explosion occurred in the morning. After this, a large column of smoke rose above the explosion site. Russian public pages write, citing eyewitnesses, that we are talking about possible damage to the gas pipeline. So that is, a bit of a challenge for the Russians there. Right, now we're going to go to distance strikes. First of all, the Russians launched more drones last night. 17 out of 22 were shot down by the air defenses, which is not a bad interception rate, I guess, but 5 still getting through. I don't know the details of where the successful Shahed drone attacks took place, what the targets were, so I can't help too much after that. Just suffice to say that Russia's attacks on Ukrainian ports have damaged 105 port facilities in 2 months. I think this has been quite a successful strategy for the Russians in terms of doing meaningful damage. I think it depends what your metrics of success are. I think if you're trying to succeed in being a total war criminal, then yeah. But actually, they have if their intention is to destroy Ukrainian grain infrastructure and storage, then they've done a good job of doing that. I guess is what I'm trying to say. They have really hammered Ismail Reni and Odessa to the point that they have caused an awful lot of problem. And when I presume when Ukraine moved better air defense systems into Odessa, then they moved south to the Danube River. And it's this game as kind of whack-a-mole that the Russians, I talk about that in many contexts, but the Russians are doing that with targets within Ukraine, I guess, at the moment, which is moved to different targets when the Ukrainians bring better air defenses there. So Russia claimed that they shot down 3 drones at some point last night. Actually, I think it's more, but the point was this is in the Bryansk and Belgorod regions, so into Russia. And later on, Russian authorities reported 6 down drones in Bryansk region. So there were some attacks into Russia last night. I don't know if any of them were successful. I don't know what the outcome of them were, but they claimed to have shot down 11 in Yevpatoria, and this is where we're going to go to next. And this was a significant hit into Crimea again. So okay, with Russian radar systems largely destroyed, now we're just hitting anything we want in Crimea, says Jay in Kyiv. Russian base in occupied Yevpatoria, Crimea, hit with drones. Things are moving quickly now. So there were a number of sort of drone sightings and whatnot. The first seconds of this video shows a member of the Ukrainian drone swarm heading towards their target. Now, I don't know, it hasn't got, there's a still image of this. This drone is quite an interesting one. So that you can't really see it very well there, but I have a feeling it's like got two tails on it, and it's a different type. I couldn't work out what drone it was, but anyway, that's been sighted. But what's taken place in Yevpatoria? First of all, let me show you where that is. Thanks to JR, who's put the rigs on here that the Ukrainians now control in the Black Sea. So you can see actually one of them really is quite close. I thought that was on fire for the last year, and I think but I don't know, the latest footage has that not being. Anyway, that's beside the point. Yevpatoria is here. We had an S-400 system being taken out there, and radar capabilities, I think, in Mayak as well, that then led to attacks on Sevastopol and hitting the ships 2 nights ago. Well, Yevpatoria was hit last night, and the claims are that it's actually another S-400 battery. So we had one taken out there, another battery taken out here. Now, it's difficult to know definitely what happened. There seems to be one large explosion. So in the early morning, a drone attack on Crimea, presumably Russian air defense base near Yevpatoria, was attacked. So that's an air defense base. Explosions were reported to the west side of Yevpatoria. It is well-known location of Russian air defense base. And by air defense, we mean like a battery of S-400, for example. Footage of drones used to attack Yevpatoria area this morning. So there were drones that were definitely used. And here is one of those drones smoking on the ground, not having really done anything particular. But nonetheless, you know, there were definitely at least drones, but we'll see that the claims are far more than just drones. Additional footage of the attack on the first 2 videos, it can be heard how drones are flying, as well as small arms air defense guns firing as well. Just an awful lot going on. As you can see, sizable explosion there, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, what were they going to hit? We'll have a look at this. So, update to the previous geolocation. Here's a Russian S-400 SAM battery that was likely targeted by Ukrainian drones early this morning outside of Yevpatoria. Imagery is from 2 weeks ago, so definitely in place 2 weeks ago. Now, my question is, if there's just one explosion, is that enough to take out a battery? But if the battery is this closely situated, where you have revetments with all the pieces next to each other, I mean, this just reeks of madness. But then what do I know about air defense? But the thing about the Patriot air defense system is you can spread them out. So when the Russians claim to have taken out that Patriot battery in Kiev, if you remember, but it turns out that they only minorly damaged one part that was able to be fixed pretty much on site. they claim to have taken out the whole battery, but the battery is spread out, over a kilometer, and you can have elements of that up to, I think, 30 kilometers away. So the Ukrainians would never have put like high-value Patriot system or battery all next to each other, because you're just inviting disaster. Well, that appears to be what's going on with the S-400. Maybe the S-400 needs to be closer. I don't know. But anyway, likely target of the drone is the air defense base of the Russian Federation, the P-400 or RT-32 radio telescope in the Yevpatoria area. So we got lots of... famously, there was a guy, I think, that got in trouble in this area, but they haven't moved it. I think he got in trouble, or certainly... there was a lot of kickback about a tourist taking a selfie, basically, in front of, or having a picture taken in front of this S-400 and S-300 air defense system. And yet, that was last year, right? It appears to still be in the same place. So, go figure. Maybe they were relying on, there you go. So maybe one big explosion, one big hit here can take out all of that stuff. So maybe they were relying on the other S-400 to protect this one, so they didn't need to move it because it was kind of protected by the other S-400 or something. I don't know, but it seems kind of short-sighted to me. Anyway, claims are today that it's not really just drones. The SBU and the Navy conducted a unique special operation near Yevpatoria. The interlocutor of UP in the SBU said SBU drones hit the eyes of the complex, the radars and the antennas, and after disabling the radar, the Navy units hit the S-300 and S-400 Triumph launch systems with 2 Neptune cruise missiles. The result is the Russian air defense complex Triumph, worth $1.2 billion, was destroyed. Now, whether it definitely was all destroyed, I don't know, but the Ukrainians are certainly claiming that. Next to here saying S-400 Triumph air defense system was destroyed near Yevpatoria. Special operation was carried out by the counterintelligence of the SBU and Ukrainian navies. So working like drones and Neptune missiles working in consort there, just good stuff. It seems that the Ukrainians are... I get the sense. So on the one hand, there are some difficult areas on the front line for the Ukrainians. There's no doubt about that. There are reports about, say, Mariinka being difficult, Avdiivka being difficult yesterday. But everywhere else, the Ukrainians appear to be turning the screw. I just really get this sense that, this is really bloody significant, right? That the Russians have lost 2 S-400 batteries protecting Sevastopol, and they've lost 2 vessels in Sevastopol, and there were 5 naval drones, which is about to find hear about that were sent apparently against the Russians last night. I just think the next month is going to be really interesting, and what else are the Russians going to lose, and how much damage are the Ukrainians going to do to the Russian armed forces away from the front line? I mean, not even talking about attacking in Robotyne or Bakhmut or here and there. I mean, there's some serious damage. Like the amount of damage that's been done in the last 2 days in Crimea, and then if you expand that to the last 2 weeks in Crimea, is phenomenal. I mean, wow. Anyway, there you go. So S-300, S-400 is being hit. That's some serious damage to Russian capabilities there. And then just off Crimea, the Kremlin says Ukraine again tried to attack a patrol ship, Sergei Kotov. The Russian MOD claimed that the ship detected and destroyed 5 Ukrainian boats. There's no evidence that happened. There's no evidence it didn't happen. Don't know what the outcome was, even if that is the claim. Just that's out there from the Russian MOD. Right. Moving on to other bits and pieces. This is, I didn't know quite where to put this. I love this bit. So the Invictus Games, if you don't know, are for the injured armed forces personnel in the world, a bit like the Olympic Games for injured soldiers and whatnot, and Air Force and Navy and whatnot. So it's Prince Harry's kind of thing that he's done for the last few years. He started it, but I like this.
I want to take a moment to recognize Team Ukraine and one very special person in particular, Tyra. Where are you? Tyra.
So she missed last year's Invictus Games because she was a prisoner of war in Russian captivity.
Thank you for standing so I can see you. I don't think I've ever met someone as courageous and resilient as you. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that you embody the true spirit of Ukraine and of Invictus. And it is so good to see you and feel your energy in person, because man, did we miss you last year.
Good stuff, Harry. Got a lot of time for him. That's brilliant. So good that Ukraine are getting recognised there. Right. I was umming and ahhing whether I should say anything about Musk again, but there's so much stuff coming out, and it is so pertinent to this. Now, the first thing I want to say is that yesterday people had a go at me, some people had a go at me, for saying, look, Musk has the right, as a private citizen, he has the right to do X and Y and Z with his corporation or his company in a war zone in Ukraine. He has the right to do that. So two things to say to that. One, I wasn't actually saying he didn't have the right. He might have the right, but it doesn't mean he is right to do it, or that he's got rational justification for doing that. That's what I was saying. Like his reasoning was bunkum. Like it's really problematic, logical or illogical reasoning. Like, I have the right to shout invective and swear at my mother in the middle of a supermarket. Like, I can walk up to my mum and just shout in the supermarket and swear in her face. But I'll be a dick for doing so, right? So that's kind of my point. He might have the right to do that. It doesn't mean it is right to do it. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second point is that there are some people that argue that he doesn't actually have the right, that he's actually contravening US law. But I've seen some analyses that say actually he is breaking US law in doing some of the things he's done. Anyway, that aside, this is causing a bit of a ruckus. This is Sky News speaking or trying to interview him, trying to get an answer out of him. I don't know quite what they're expecting, but this is actually, becoming pretty big newsworthy things.
Has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives, sir? A Ukrainian official says that you have enabled Vladimir Putin as an aggressor. What do you say to that? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding, Mr. Musk. Do you appreciate that? What would you call Vladimir Putin? How has your ego and ignorance, sir, cost Ukrainian lives? A senior war official says it has.
That is pretty in-your-face questioning there. Has your ego and ignorance cost Ukrainian lives? Now, there's stuff coming out at the moment saying Elon Musk has agreed to sell a portion of Starlink assets to the US DoD, removing himself from decision-making regarding geofencing Ukraine's access to the satellite internet service, according to the biographer. This is where tenses actually are really important. Grammar is really important. Has means that he's just agreed to do that. It should be had. I think this is referring back to the removal of geofencing for some of the terminals that Starlink have given to, and this new contract that they had worked out with the Department of Defense. So this isn't a reaction to the last 24 hours of being given hassle. I just want to clear that up. Mail Online here saying that Elon Musk biographer Walter Isaacson claims the billionaire sold Starlink equipment to US military and even created special Star Shield, which I mentioned yesterday, for them during the Ukraine conflict after getting in over his head with geofencing. Right, so this isn't a new thing. This is what had happened previously. And there is an absolutely fascinating transcript in the Washington Post with Walter Isaacson, the author there, between him and Mr. Ignatius, right? I'm just going to dip into some of this. This is really newsworthy in my opinion. So Isaacson says, yeah, as you know, the Ukrainians were launching a secret attack on the Russian fleet in Crimea using Starlink to get those drone submarines there. And that night, Musk got very excitable. He can be apocalyptic at times. He told me that, quote, I'm not allowing them to use Starlink. I'm not allowing them to use Starlink because it could start World War III. Right, I go and watch one of Vlad Vexler's latest Marxist chat. So he's the philosopher that has a great channel. Well, he's got kind of a bunch of channels that discuss Russia and the Russian mindset, but also he did one on Musk and Trump yesterday, talking about how Putin sees them and how what their position is. And he says Musk has basically sucked up. He calls him a constructive enemy, which is a polite way of saying useful idiot, I think. But he says he's completely sucked up the Russian narrative of escalation. So Musk is genuinely afraid of a nuclear war. Is one argument. I would say he's also got vested interest, economic interest in Russia and China as well. And we'll go on to China as well, because he's just got into hot water saying some nut stuff about Taiwan and China. But anyway, the claim is that he is genuinely afraid. He is apocalyptic of an escalation there. But that is just flat wrong. Russia, look what's just happened in Crimea. They've lost a submarine and a landing vessel, which is exactly what he didn't want to happen, and it's happened. Is there a nuclear war? No, because that's nonsense. Anyway, Isaacson said, I made a mistake, which I mentioned a couple of days ago, and I've said, which, as I put in the book, he cut off Starlink. In fact, what he did was reaffirm the decision that it could not be enabled on the Crimean coast, would not be enabled on the Crimean coast. And I have all the text messages back and forth because the Ukrainians didn't know that. So this is extra information today that I'm telling you. And this is really important. So that night, the essential point is that night, Musk did make the decision not to enable Starlink to be used for this sneak attack. Now, I should have just expressed it that way, which is he decided not to enable Starlink to be used for the sneak attack. But that leads to the broader question of what gives him the power to decide whether or not a sneak attack on Crimea is something that should be allowed, and whether or not it would lead to a wider war. This is super important, right? As Isaacson rightly says, who is he to decide the outcome of a war? This is why we let governments to enact foreign policy, right? They are making those decisions on our behalf. We don't vote for a billionaire to do that for us, right? To settle international disputes. So Mr. Ignatius says back, I want to come to that question of his quasi-diplomatic role in this crisis, but I want to focus on one detail here that I find, and I think others still find puzzling, which is, why didn't Ukrainians know, this is the key, why didn't Ukrainians know that Starlink was blocked in Crimea when they began planning this drone mission? That's the rationale I gave for Musk's claim being wrong the other day. They put a lot of effort into it. It was a significant offensive, but it was doomed to fail given the position that Musk says he had already taken. Why were the Ukrainians so surprised to learn that they wouldn't get Starlink coverage in Crimea? And Isaacson replies, because Musk had not enabled it at Crimea and kept that a secret. Just let that sink in. There's so much I want to say to this, but the fact that he's keeping that kind of information secret, which is absolutely integral to the planning stages of that mission, let alone the success of that mission. They would never have planned that mission had they known that. So this is something he had kept secret. This is really, really bloody important, because we know that Starlink is a backbone of the Ukrainian war effort, right? And no one's denying how important Starlink is, and no one's denying how wonderful it was that Starlink, that Musk came along with Starlink to help Ukraine. But to then secretly keep part of that back that would screw up a Ukrainian mission is deeply problematic. And by the way, you probably seen in the book, there's all these encrypted text messages that I was given because it happens in Donbass as well. Not just Crimea, it's the Donbass. They can't figure out, because Musk also decides not to enable it in parts of eastern Ukraine because he doesn't want it to be used for offensive purposes. When I grilled Musk on that, he said, well, if you read the terms of service, it was only supposed to be used for defensive purposes. And I've already explained how that's a problem. It's just defensive. And they go on to talk about this. When you're defending your own country, you're doing offensive things in your own country by way of that is your defense. So the distinction is completely false. Well, we'll read the text messages from Fedorov and the other Ukrainians. He's saying, Fedorov, this is my village we're talking about. You can't call that an offensive thing. They're trying to protect my village. And so that was the thing that happened that night on the sneak attack. It wasn't just that he refused to enable it, but the Ukrainians didn't even know that it had been, and Europe, all this intelligence stuff. The technical term is it had been geofenced within 100 kilometers of the Crimean coast. The decision had been made earlier to geofence it. And then they do the same in Donbass without telling the Ukrainians. This is massively important. He's got encrypted messages to back this up, right? And so in real time, you can see these text messages going back and forth saying, quote, you've got to enable this. This is my home village. We've got to fight there. And also they wanted him. Fedorov shows him the sub and how they designed a drone sub using a Starlink, and Musk says that's really amazing, that's wonderful, but this would have caused a nuclear explosion if I had enabled you to use it. Ignatius then says, and that's Walter Isaacson, why did Musk keep the fact that Starlink was not enabled for Crimea secret from the Ukrainians? In effect, they were walking into a trap. They thought they had coverage when that they didn't. Why did he keep it secret? Isaacson says it was geofence, as I said. He felt that the terms of service it wasn't supposed to be used for offensive purposes. You and I can discuss all you want whether or not Crimea, is part of Ukraine, and it should have been included, but it wasn't. And, why didn't he tell? I mean, that's another great point. It's like, hang on, so you can do kind of offensive things in Zaporizhia, right? But you can't do it in Crimea. Because why? Because you are agreeing with Russia that illegally annexed area is Russia. So either way is a bad look. And, why didn't he tell the Ukrainians exactly where the geofence was? Frankly, I don't know. So Ignatius then replies, and sorry, it's just a few more bits. It's just so important, this. So just to roll back the tape a bit, a few months, as you suggested earlier, Musk began as quite supportive of Ukraine, arguably critically supportive. You write that in the first week of the war, he was holding meetings every day with his own Starlink engineers to discuss how to support Ukraine. You have a quote. And the quote is, unlike every other company and even parts of the US military, they, Starlink, were able to find ways to defeat Russian jamming. You note that Starlink kits were connecting the Ukrainian military to our Joint Special Operations Command, our most secretive operatives in the country. It was Gwynne Shotwell, the CEO of SpaceX, who was nervous about the extent of involvement more than Musk in the early phase. So my question is, what happened? What changed him from being all in to being very nervous and suddenly geofencing all these areas when he had been such a supporter? I don't get it. Isaacson says, I've talked to him during this whole thing, and there was late one night he said, why am I in this war? He said, I created Starlink so people could chill and watch Netflix, movies, and play video games. I did not mean to create something that might cause a nuclear war. And then I just asked him, and it was a question, but I think he, took it as maybe prodding. I said, have you talked to Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor? Have you talked to General Mark Milley of the Joint Chiefs? And he had. He had been talking to them, and he said, if they tell me to do something, I would do it if I got a directive. But what he did, which I think is the right outcome, is he decided to sell and give total control over a certain amount of Starlink equipment, Starlink services to the US military, so that he no longer controls the geofencing. He no longer controls the terms of use. So a certain amount of this infrastructure, or maybe a certain amount of the terminals or whatever, the US can now do what they want in terms of their military objectives and in the national interest of the US. So that's what we're talking about. And that happened previously. It's not a new thing. He's even created something called Starshield, which is a military version of the Starlink satellite. And so I think that was his way of saying, I got to get out of this, even if I don't believe I should have this much. Even if I don't believe I should have this much power. Of course, that leads to a larger question too, which is why couldn't any other US company, why couldn't the military have built satellites at work? But now they're buying these Starlink satellites, and I think that kind of resolves the situation. You and I at least would prefer to have the US government be in charge of making that decision, as opposed to Elon Musk, a private citizen. That's kind of the point. Ignatius then replies, there's a moment that's particularly telling and arguably troubling when Musk talks to a Russian ambassador to the United States in what's almost a diplomatic role, and the ambassador tells him that a Ukrainian attack on Crimea could lead to a nuclear response. The idea of that message being conveyed from a Russian ambassador to an American business person, a threat of nuclear war, is astonishing to me. And I'm just wondering, Walter, did he pick up the phone and call Jake Sullivan and say, I just heard from the Russian ambassador that there's a nuclear war ahead if something happens in Crimea? What did he do? Isaacson says he did call Jake Sullivan. He could call Mark Milley. Or he did call Mark Milley. I don't know if he called right away, but he had conversations, and he explained in late night conversations, he would tell me here's Russian doctrine, here's Russian law. An attack on the homeland could invite a nuclear response. And I'm saying to myself, but even asking him the question, have you asked Jake Sullivan? Have you asked Mark Milley? And that's the way it does evolve. Even he realizes that these decisions should be turned over to the US military. He's talked to ambassadors, and this is interesting. He's talked to the Chinese ambassador quite a bit too, you know. I wonder why his position on Taiwan is really controversial. And he's got vested interests in Chinese raw materials. This is why this is an interesting book. This guy read superhero comic books in the corner of the library when he was a little kid because nobody would play with him. And I think he internalized the notion that sometimes you run around with your underpants on the outside and try to save the world. There you go. I think that's really, really interesting. I've talked way too long now. It's been a really long one, but I think that was super, super important. I'll probably leave that one to tomorrow's news. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. That's a really long first video. I'll try and make the next one shorter, but actually there's so much news coming out. It's just a really rich vein of news at the moment. Take care. Speak soon.